Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Seagull Football Network. Today, we are going to be doing the AFC North. That is the Baltimore Ravens, Cleveland Browns, Pittsburgh Steelers, and Cincinnati Bengals. Super excited to get into it with you guys. Obviously, we're going to be following the same pattern that we do normally: biggest strength, weakness, X factor, etc. I have Braden on the line, obviously, and he is going to go ahead and kick us off with the Baltimore Ravens, the division winner last year, and their biggest strength. Braden, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I was looking into this team, digging into the stats a little bit, I got to the point where I've decided the Ravens' biggest strength this season is going to be play action and the run game for the offense. The Ravens are already a pretty strong team as far as that goes. They've been pretty consistent in the run game. They like their strong head down running backs, and Lamar Jackson has definitely benefited from play action. Last season, excluding RPOs and play action passes, he averaged 7.22 yards per attempt. On RPOs, he averaged 10.38, and on play action, 9.05. So that's a pretty huge increase in yards on play action and RPOs. And you take this team, and they're already good at it, and now you throw Derrick Henry into the mix. I just don't see I don't see a way that the play action and the run game aren't going to benefit and be a huge asset for this team moving forward this season.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I mean, their run game has been consistently one of the best for the last, 6 years, even pre Lamar Jackson. It was an incredible run game, strong team. Um, I think that, in my opinion, the biggest strength is the defense. Even losing defensive coordinator Mike McDonald to the Seattle Seahawks, we talked about that a little bit last week. Those of you who watched our Seattle Seahawks bit, obviously I talked really highly of Mike McDonald, his incredibly talented play calling, how he puts together a really versatile secondary, incredible pass rushers, run blockers, everything there in the defense. I'm a big fan of McDonald's defense. That being said, I think that the Ravens have the personnel that Mike McDonald wishes he had in Seattle now. With Michael Pierce and Justin Madubuike in the middle of the defensive line, we talked about that a little bit. Odafe Owa and Kyle Van Noy being their pass rushers. I think one of their biggest losses this past year was Patrick Queen, who signed with the division rival Pittsburgh Steelers. Malik Harrison is a third rounder from a couple of years back, and I think he's going to be the starter there next to Roquan Smith. I don't dislike Malik Harrison. I think there's going to be some growing pains for him for sure, but we'll definitely see that defense with the secondary: Marlon Humphrey, Brandon Stevens, Kyle Hamilton, Marcus Williams, and new rookie first rounder Nate Wiggins out of Clemson. That team is going to be a very strong defense once again. They were number one in points allowed last year as a defense. New defensive coordinator Zach Orr is a former Baltimore Ravens linebacker. I think that this defense is going to shine even more now than they did under McDonald.
Yeah, I completely agree. I almost picked the defense as their biggest strength, um, but I think the improvements in the run game were enough for me to pivot over. But absolutely, I agree. The defense is going to be potentially even better than it was last year. I really like the personnel. I like that they've maintained a lot of consistency, and I'm excited to see what they do this season. Yes, that brings us up to the biggest weakness. What do you have listed for the Ravens?
So for the Ravens' biggest weakness, I feel like just like their run game has been one of their strongest parts of their team over the past 3 or 4 years, 5, 6 years, their receiving core has been one of the weakest. Obviously, Zay Flowers was very good as a rookie. I think he definitely projects to that roster as the best receiver still. Rashad Bateman received an extension this past offseason with the team, and that's good. And it was a good extension. I mean, it hit before all of those big receiver deals, but I think I still wouldn't say he's lived up to his expectations as a former first rounder. He's been good, not great. Obviously, Nelson Aguilar and Deontay Hardy kind of round out those starting receivers, but those two guys are well past the development stage of their careers. They're definitely not the most versatile receivers on that roster. I think if the Ravens are looking for another solid receiver, rookie Devontae Walker, they drafted him in the fourth round out of North Carolina. He's a very solid option, but right now he's no guaranteed quantity. Really, we don't know what to expect from him. Tight ends Mark Andrew and Isaiah Likely both. Well, Mark Andrews was injured, but they both played almost 60%, I think, of the snaps that they were healthy for. And I think that they are fine as receiving threats, but they're not going to be able to carry that receiving core. So I definitely think that this is a weakness for Baltimore.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for the last couple of years, I've been talking about how bad the Baltimore receivers are. How if they really want Lamar to succeed, they've got to get him some number one threat. They've got to have some better options for him. I don't think he's the best pure passer to begin with, and then you give him no weapons, and he's just gonna struggle. And he's been pretty good, all things considered, two-time MVP. But we have seen some ups and downs from him over the last couple seasons. So I completely agree. I think the receivers are not great, but I actually went a slightly different direction and picked the offensive line. I think with them losing three starters this season, with Morgan Moses, John Simpson, and Kevin Zeitler all leaving, they've got some big holes that they're going to have to figure out how to fill. Their center, Tyler Linderbaum, I think he's awesome. I think he's one of the best centers in the league, probably number two or three. Um, the only other person who's consistent on the line from last year is Ronnie Stanley, and he's been pretty rough around the edges when healthy, which hasn't been all that often. And so I think they've really got some issues there, and they're going to have to figure out what they can put together if they're going to make that run game as deadly as I think it can be. Lamar obviously benefits from being able to scramble. Derrick Henry, we've seen what happens when he doesn't have a great O line, and so I think this weakness could have a major impact on how their offense operates this season.
I agree. I think it'll be a really interesting thing to watch because if you kind of look at who's projecting to start in those positions now that John Simpson, Zeitler, and Morgan Moses left, obviously Morgan Moses and John Simpson are now New York Jets. It's really interesting because at left guard, we're probably going to see Ben Cleveland, and then right tackle Patrick Mikari, and then right guard is probably going to be I think it could be Andrew Voorhees or rookie John Rosengarten. I think he was drafted in the second round, 62nd overall. Um, you could see any of those players kind of playing at guard there. It's really interesting because Cleveland Mikari and Voorhees are all Ravens last year too. So they're familiar with the scheme. And, playbook wise, they're really good. With all of that. But it's just going to be interesting to see if there's going to be a talent drop at all with those players. And frankly, they're all pretty unproven talents. So it's going to be very, very intriguing. Yeah, Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry are arguably some of the most threatening players in the NFL when they're healthy. Actually, that does bring me to my X factor for the Baltimore Ravens being running back Derrick Henry. Obviously, everybody knows it's been 3 years since Derrick Henry hit the 2027-yard mark that he did in 2020. He became one of a very elite group of running backs to hit 2,000 yards. And I think he is still a very great runner. He's never dipped below 4 yards per attempt since that year. Um, but he definitely has shown a little bit of a decrease over the past 3 or 4 years. Um, with the Ravens' dynamic rushing scheme, their tendency to balance multiple running backs, I expect somewhat of a resurgence here for Derrick Henry. Obviously, last year they started Gus Edwards and rotated in Justice Hill. Now they're going to be starting Derrick Henry and rotating in Justice Hill. I think that Derrick Henry could be the lightning in a bottle for already one of the best offenses in the league. I don't expect 2,000 yards from him again. Obviously, he's creeping up on 30 at this point. But I think that there's a real chance that he becomes that final piece to put this offense over the edge.
It might be interesting how it turns out with them trying to gel together, and hopefully they can pull something together and keep Lamar and Henry both healthy as they move through the season.
Yeah, and I think that it's worth noting, the last time that Derrick Henry was considered truly an elite running back in this league, was like we talked about that 2020 2,000-yard season. He had 5.4 yards per carry, 17 touchdowns, an absolutely incredible season. That was Arthur Smith's last year as the offensive coordinator. And Arthur Smith, he's known for a lot of things in recent memory. Obviously, his Atlanta tenure was less than stellar, to put it nicely. But he definitely hasn't had an offensive coordinator who can put together a dynamic running game like that since. However, in Baltimore, I truly believe he has that again with former Georgia offensive coordinator Todd Monken. And so, given that, I think that it could be a very good thing for him, and he could be back in an offense that truly works with him and makes him that type of running back again.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. He's the X factor I picked as well. I think the biggest question there are two big questions. Number one is the O line going to be good enough to be able to make space for him, protect Lamar? That's the biggest question that I feel hanging over it. And then the second question is, does he have enough left in the tank? And I think the evidence from the last couple seasons is that he definitely does, as long as he stays healthy and has that O line. The Titans love them, could not defend the quarterback, could not create space for the running back to save their lives. He was hit behind the line of scrimmage so many times over the last 2 years, it was ridiculous. And so if the Ravens O line can pull something together, give him some space to operate, let him get up to that speed that he definitely still has, I think he'll be just fine. Can he hit 2K? Maybe. It's unlikely, but I think 1,500, 1,700 easily doable as long as he has an O line that's top half. In all fairness, in 2021, he was on track for another really, really big season, either 2,000 or close to 2,000 before his broken foot. So I don't know that 2020 was the last season he was elite, but since the injury, he's definitely seen there's been a difference in his performance. All right, well, that finishes up the X factor since we both agreed. That's always nice. So keeping on kind of the same theme, the notable rookie I chose is offensive lineman Roger Rosengarten. I'm just rolling all the way through this run game O line issue. I think it's going to be pivotal for them, and I think if Roger Rosengarten can pan out into a solid starter, even just an okay starter, I think it's going to be a really good thing for the Ravens. They don't have to keep looking for somebody to fill in this hole, protect Lamar Jackson. I think if he can just plug and play day one, that's going to be the best thing for them.
Yeah, no, I he wasn't my notable rookie, but he definitely is a notable rookie. I think Roger Rosengarten can and should start on this offensive line. I personally, I liked Andrew Voorhees coming out of college, but it's worth noting that he hasn't played a snap of football in almost 3 years now. That is a long time to be out of football. Obviously, we're going to talk about somebody else like that later, Deshaun Watson. So you kind of see a drop off in terms of ability after 3 years of not playing football. And so I think that Roger Rosengarten definitely can play in this league, and I think that he will be. I agree. A key factor in helping Derrick Henry get to those levels and helping Lamar Jackson continue to be a prolific passer. Um, I kind of went the opposite direction with my notable rookie, and it kind of goes hand in hand with my biggest weakness, similar to yours. I talked about the receiving core, right? My notable rookie is North Carolina receiver Devontae Walker. The Ravens took him fourth round, 113th overall. He was There's a reason he went in the fourth round. He's not a rounded receiver yet, but he's a solid receiver. He's got a really strong catch radius, good vertical route ability. He struggles mightily on these in and out breaking routes. He's not very shifty in the red zone. Obviously, it doesn't help that he had, an offense that wasn't very well tuned to anything but the vertical game. Um, but I think if he's given the opportunity in this weak receiver room behind only, frankly, Bateman and Flowers, I think he could very quickly develop and become a favorite target for Lamar Jackson, which could help round out this offense.
Yeah, absolutely. I was looking at him as an alternative pick for my notable rookie, and yeah, I think if he can come in and perform and get a spot as the number two, number three, number four wide receiver, he could definitely make an impact in a very weak receiver room. All right, and that brings us to our final section for the Ravens here, the biggest games. I know we already talked a couple weeks ago about week one at the Chiefs. I don't think it can be overstated just how important this game is going to be for the season. Um, Rematch of the AFC Championship, slightly different teams, but for the most part, they've kept almost the same rosters. And I think both teams have only improved in the changes that they have made. So potentially another championship game preview, and it's possible that the Ravens can get their revenge on the Chiefs. So I also had on my list Week 12 at the Chargers, matchup of the Harbaughs, brother versus brother. It's going to be an interesting game. Both teams are going to want to run down the other team's throats. It's going to be an aggressive, trench fought battle. And then the last game that I had was Week 17 at the Texans. Another one that might have big playoff implications late in the season to high-powered teams that maybe have some playoff seeding implications as well. Who's going to get more games at home? Who's going to host maybe a championship? So that's also a really good, interesting game to pay attention to. The only other big thing to note is that the Ravens bye week is very, very late. It is week 14. So if they have injuries that build up, it's going to be a rough season for them.
Yeah, no, going hand in hand with that, actually, I picked a trio of games later in the season, shortly after their bye, and based because their bye is so late, I think that it could affect these games. My three were Week 16 versus Pittsburgh, Week 17 at Houston, and Week 18 versus Cleveland. Those three games being back to back to back, that's terrifying for the Baltimore Ravens. I think it could be a season deciding trio for them. Baltimore obviously is going to be one of the best teams in the AFC this year. We all know it. But I don't think that any of those three teams is a team to be trifled with. And frankly, they could ruin the Ravens' season in the blink of an eye. They lose two of those three games. The Ravens could be looking at fifth or seventh seed. It could be from top dog to bottom of the playoffs in a snap, and that's a scary prospect for a team like the Ravens.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously the Ravens are going to hope that by the time the bye rolls around, they're 13-0 and can rest all their starters. But in that's an impossible ask in the NFL. So yeah, they're definitely going to be. Yeah, they're going to want to be well rested. They're going to want to win all three of those games, if not at least two of them, to maintain whatever playoff position they have, for sure.
For sure. And then obviously, this is a little bit of a gimme, but I I listed week 5, 8, 10, 11, 16, and 18. Uh, that's all six of their divisional games. AFC North divisional games are some of the roughest, most violent, I'm going to kill you type of football games you will ever watch on any level of the sport. They are insane how hard these players hit in those games. The battles are won in the trenches. It's every inch. And I think that this division is going to be closer than ever this year. And so these divisional games are really going to hurt for Baltimore.
Yeah, for sure. They're always interesting games to watch. There's usually a couple major injuries that come out of them, which is super unfortunate, but it's just part of the way that this division fights. All right, that brings us up to the Cleveland Browns. Why don't you open up by talking about what their greatest strength is going to be?
Yeah, so I feel like their biggest strength is like probably one of the most obvious strengths that we could talk about on this podcast out of all 32 teams, and that is the defense. The Cleveland Browns defense was the number one defense in pretty much every category last year. It's amazing that they only won 11 games, and we'll get into that, reasoning later down the line. But their defense was healthy. Their defense was consistent. Um, they were the number one team in yards. They allowed they had so many takeaways. They, allowed very few touchdowns. They've kept almost identical personnel on defense. The only changes, frankly, are they added two linebackers to play alongside Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, and that's Jordan Hicks from Minnesota and Devin Bush from Seattle. I think that Jordan Hicks is a very good every down linebacker. Devin Bush is a little bit more of a see ball, get ball player who's going to be a little bit more rotational. But I think that both of those players are going to elevate the second level of this team. And it's going to help elevate, frankly, the only part of that defense that was less than stellar being the run game. I think that this defense is definitely going to run it back as one of the best in the game.
Yeah, absolutely. I also picked the defense. I noted there are a couple like weak points. I'm not totally convinced on the linebacker room personally. I think it's Jordan Hicks is in his 10th or 11th season, I believe. So there's a little bit of concern there, but overall, it's a solid roster. I really like Jim Schwartz and the defense that he's been coaching. Um, and of course, we can't not mention Miles Garrett, who, even though he had a slightly down year statistically last year, he's always incredible. He's always making plays. He completely flips games on their head sometimes. And so, yeah, I completely agree. That's who I picked. I think the defense is going to be their biggest strength.
Let's be fair here. A slightly down year is still four forced fumbles, 14 sacks, 17 tackles for loss, 30 quarterback hits, and 37 pressures, and then a defensive player of the year award on top of that. So if that's a down year, it doesn't really matter.
Yes, correct. It obviously still a stellar season. I don't think I think the defensive player of the year award should have gone to a different player, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Next up, let's talk about the greatest weakness. I definitely wanted to put Deshaun Watson's contract here, but I decided against it. Instead, I went with something that the GM can't control, the roster can't control, and that's the schedule. They have a brutal, brutal schedule. There are some decently easy games mixed in, but of the games before the bye, 3 out of 9 were playoff teams last year, and after the bye, 4 out of 6 are playoff teams from last year. Then you add in teams that are going to probably be pretty good this year that weren't in the playoffs last year, and you add in the Chargers and the Bengals, and they're being ranked around the third worst strength of schedule behind only the Steelers and the Patriots. So I think the schedule is going to beat them down. They've got to stay healthy. They've got to stay motivated and focused to be able to make it through this season.
For sure. It's going to be a rough season for them. Obviously, they struggled with the injuries last year. If they have anything similar to the same injury problems that they had last year, it's going to be even rougher. And there's a real chance that the Cleveland Browns are the weakest team in this division already. So they're already going to be fighting to hold on in this tough division. So it'll be really interesting to see them play against all of these really strong teams that they face. I completely agree. I kind of did play off of what you said with the contract. I just went with Deshaun Watson as a player. Um, I kind of mentioned him earlier in the Baltimore Ravens bit. I said it's been 4 years since Deshaun Watson had a truly elite season as a quarterback in the NFL. Obviously, we all remember that 2020 season where they were 4-12. Bill O'Brien got fired, but Deshaun Watson himself put up, I think it was 38 touchdowns, 7 picks, and almost 5,000 yards, like 48-26 or something. But then obviously 2021 offseason, those off-field concerns, the allegations started coming out. And while he was not suspended in 2021, he did not play due to those off-field concerns. Houston instead trotted out Davis Mills for 17 games. Um, 2022, he was suspended for the first half of the season. And then obviously, new offense, new team, didn't play for a season and a half. He struggled mightily to find a rhythm in the second half of 2022 and did have a couple of small injuries. 2023, he was adequate, but he wasn't anywhere near the level that he was in 2020. Uh, but he then got injured after only 6 games. There's not much we can draw from that other than will Deshaun Watson ever be the player we knew in 2020, right? The Cleveland Browns have done a lot of work to build around him the last few years. Obviously, Kevin Stefanski is a great offensive mind, builds a hugely successful run game that supports the quarterback. They brought in Amari Cooper, Elijah Moore, and Jerry Jeudy all within the last 2.5 years. If Watson continues to put up pedestrian numbers, it may be time to just eat the nearly $200 million in dead cap and payouts and move on. It's going to hurt. It's going to obviously be embarrassing for Andrew Berry and Kevin Stefanski, but it might be better for them to just take responsibility and cut their losses at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's with his injury last year, it's worth noting that he kind of injured it before week 6 and kind of played through a couple times and it finally got to the point where he just couldn't play anymore. It makes you wonder like what would have happened if they pulled him early, gave him a couple weeks to rest. Would he have been back for the second half of the season? Could he have had a better performance that way? Hard to tell, but uh, it seems like there's been a couple poor decisions made by leadership regarding Deshaun Watson. Um, and it's tough to see because he really was so electric. He was so fun to watch. And while that's harder now after it's harder to watch him after the allegations and everything that came out, I think it'd still be fun to have a solid Deshaun Watson instead of the injured shoulder, bad pass, just disaster that we have on the field now. So yeah, absolutely, I can agree that he's definitely one of the weaknesses for this team.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. Obviously, off-field concerns are never a good thing in the NFL. It's always sad to see that kind of happening, but it's always worth keeping in mind, these players are human too. And then obviously if you separate them as humans from the product on the field, it's still a football game at the end of the day. It's still a sport, and it's good to be able to appreciate good football players playing good football. And that's what I hope to see from Deshaun Watson this year.
Yeah, absolutely. That brings us up to the X factor. For the X factor, I chose Nick Chubb. Obviously, the gruesome injury last season, terrible to watch, just horrendous what happened. I think the biggest question is, can he return to the same level of play? Is he going to be able to come back, recover from that injury, and do well? And if he does, and he comes back and he's still solid, I think the Browns are going to have a pretty good season. He is 28 years old. It's not too old for a running back. There have been plenty of running backs older than that with phenomenal seasons, but he's also had two major season-ending leg injuries, and as a running back, that makes it a little difficult. So it's hard to tell, but I think his success is going to help determine how the offense runs this season.
Yeah, for sure. Running back shelf life is already a very interesting thing. They're typically pretty short, 5, 6 years. You're lucky if you get 8 or 9. I mean, it's not a long time. Obviously, we've seen running backs who had great beginnings to seasons get cut short by injuries. Chris Carson, Tariq Cohen are some to name a few. But I think that kind of leads me into my X factor, agreeing with the whole Nick Chubb thing. And my X factor is the depth. The depth of this team is really going to determine the success of this team. Obviously, we saw last year the Cleveland Browns had nearly $50 million worth of players on injured reserve by the end of the season. That is a lot of money that you're not using anymore. I think that they definitely could have won more than 11 games, potentially could have won the division, and probably would have been more competitive and potentially won against Houston in the playoffs if they had remained healthier or had more depth. Their depth last year was horrendous. They didn't have players who could actually successfully step in the positions that these players were going down. But here are a few names kind of to represent additions that they made in terms of depth, some names that I thought were relevant. Jameis Winston from New Orleans, Quentin Jefferson from New York, Naeem Hines from Buffalo, Devin Bush from Seattle, Tyler Huntley from Baltimore, Deontay Foreman from Chicago, Brian Allen from Los Angeles, and Hakeem Adeniji from Minnesota. That's just a few. They had like 9, 10, 12 free agent signings that were like obviously just for depth. They knew their starters were good. These are guys who can step in the case of emergency. One of the things I'd like to note is there were two quarterbacks, Jameis Winston and Tyler Huntley, and then there were two running backs, Naeem Hines and Deontay Foreman. So if and when they start running into issues, especially like you said, if Nick Chubb maybe isn't the same player, if maybe he just, needs a little bit more time on the sideline, they have those kinds of players. If Deshaun Watson either gets injured or isn't the player we thought he was going to be, they have options. And I think that that is an incredibly powerful uh, plan for a team like the Cleveland Browns.
Yeah, absolutely. I was noting the addition of Deontay Foreman. Obviously, being a Titans fan, I watched him a couple years ago when Henry got injured. I think he's a really solid running back. He can absolutely pick it up when somebody else goes down and maintain pace. He's been super impressive. And yeah, I think that's a really good addition to back up Nick Chubb in case he's not ready. All right, who do you have as the notable rookie for the Cleveland Browns?
So my notable rookie's a little bit out there. I think I'll be honest. I wasn't a big fan of the Cleveland Browns draft class. I think that Michael Hall really won't be anything more than a rotational player in the NFL. Zach Zinter can be a starter eventually, but he's going to need some, development. Jamari Thrash is fine. Anyway, my notable rookie is actually cornerback Miles Harden. He was drafted seventh round, pick 227. That's a little bit of a reach, in my opinion, in terms of a notable rookie. But let me kind of back this up for you. Um, when I was kind of doing draft research and all of that, Miles Harden wasn't even on my radar. I never watched him. I never graded him. I, wasn't really aware of his existence as a player. But obviously, when the Browns drafted him, I looked into him because I wanted to be familiar with these names. Um, and frankly, if I could name one Browns rookie who's going to have an impact on the 2024 Browns, it's going to be Miles Harden. First of all, incredible tackler, has a real nose for the football. So worst comes to worst, he's a great special teams addition, especially with the new kickoff rules and everything. However, they've already got a good secondary. But talking about depth, things like that, I think Miles Harden could make an impact at outside corner, slot corner, high safety, in the box. I think he could be a serviceable starter in any of those positions with a good camp and a good preseason. I think he's flexible. He's a very strong safety. The reason he fell to the seventh was he had a lot of injuries in college. I want to say he had 5 or 6 years in college because of that. But I think that if he can overcome those injury concerns, he definitely can be a starter in the NFL sooner rather than later.
Interesting, yeah. I didn't really expect to hear a seventh round pick as the notable rookie, but I appreciate the justification for it. Yeah. I also was not impressed with their draft at all. They had no first round pick, only 6 picks total, and none of them just seemed like they were going to be stellar performers on the field when they get there. Um, all just kind of middling picks. They're all right. They're fine. Um, but I did end up going with their second round pick, Michael Hall Jr. Primarily because I think it just joining the Browns gives him a great place to learn and grow and develop a little better. Being surrounded by such great defensive players and being in a great scheme, I think it just gives him a really good chance at success moving forward, whether it's with the Browns or another team.
Yeah, if there's a defensive lineman that he should be learning under and that will actually help him be a contributor in the NFL, it's Dalvin Tomlinson. So I think it's a good place for him to be.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, and that brings us to the last point here, biggest games. Once again, I kind of picked a stretch of games. This one's also near the end of the season, similar to the Ravens. I picked weeks 15 through 18, and here's why. They start out hosting the Chiefs, then they go and they play the Bengals in Cincinnati, then they host the Dolphins, and then they go play in Baltimore. 3 of those 4 teams are playoff teams from last year, and the Bengals, if they can pull things together, have proven that they're a dominant team, especially in the division. That's a really, really tough set of games, especially to finish out the season. Like we talked about with the schedule earlier, it's just going to be super difficult for them to pull anything together. What are your thoughts on that?
No, actually, we hit on the same games here. I said their post bye schedule, which is 11 through 18, mostly being that week 12, 14, 16, and 18 are all divisionals. There's a week in between each one. Between weeks 13 and 18, 4 of their 6 games are away games. And then obviously, like you said, that's 4 straight playoff level teams. Possibly Pittsburgh is a playoff level team, so 6 out of their last 7. It's a grueling stretch of games pretty much post bye. So thankfully, they're coming off of a mid-season bye. Not thankfully, it's against some of the hardest teams to face in the NFL this year.
Yeah, for sure. Just a brutal set of games there. I don't know. I don't know exactly what to expect from the Browns because of some of the stuff we talked about. Is Deshaun going to be, okay again? Is Nick Chubb going to be able to play for the first, half quarter of a season? Who knows? And so there's a lot of question marks, and I don't know what to expect from the Browns, especially that late in the season.
I agree completely. I already said, even with their depth additions, I think there's a real chance that the Cleveland Browns are the worst team in this division. Now, obviously, we were for our viewers, we were talking right before we started recording, and I was like, "Oh, the AFC North is like the best division in the NFL." they're gonna, beat the trash out of each other every week. It's gonna be such a fun division. And you were like, oh no, they're not the best division. So obviously we disagree a little bit on that. But the Cleveland Browns are still a very good team. It's just a question of obviously they face the Bengals, Steelers, and Ravens, 6 times total. They've got a really tough schedule. So even if they're a very good team, in my opinion, what's their record going to be? There's a real chance they could win 7 or 8 games, even with the roster they have.
Yeah, I think for the most part, I think the Browns and the Steelers are going to be all right. I think they're going to be okay. The Bengals are a little harder to tell, and we'll get more into that later. I think only the really clear, like, oh, this is a really good team right now, based on the information we have. I think it's the Ravens. Um, the Browns, obviously, like, there's a bunch of question marks there. The Steelers have had a bunch of different changes, especially on the offensive side of the ball, and the Bengals, it really depends. They haven't. Last year was a really terrible season for them. Obviously, they had a lot of unfortunate things happen between Burrow's injury and just some bad luck otherwise, but it's hard to tell if they'll get back to that same pattern. But we'll get into all of that a little bit later. That's just kind of where I was coming from when I said no. I'm not sure it's going to be the most competitive division when we get into it. I think the Ravens are going to dominate, and somebody might be a couple games behind them, and then everybody else is just kind of middle of the pack.
I will counter that with the note that these teams, other than the Ravens, all struggled with consistency, injuries, tough schedules last year, and not a single one of them ended under 9 wins. That tells you exactly how strong this division is, in my opinion. I think that Pittsburgh has only gotten better. Arthur Smith is better suited as an offensive coordinator. Um, I think Cleveland has the toughest schedule, and they're still a really strong team. I think, Baltimore, obviously I agree, is the best team, but I think Cincinnati's going to be right back at it too. As much as I understand where you're coming from with the whole like, there's a lot of change, I still think these teams are all incredible NFL teams and will be probably all four top half in 2024.
Let's jump into the third team here, the Pittsburgh Steelers. What is your projected biggest strength for them?
I was so tempted to put TJ Watt as the biggest strength, but I decided to be a little bit more flexible with it, and I said their pass rush. Um, TJ Watt by himself is already a formidable player. If he's healthy, he's almost Miles Garrett level of just game wrecking potential. Obviously, Cam Hayward is always good. He doesn't matter how old this man is, he's going to continue to play well. They have rotational pass rushers, Alex Highsmith, Nate Herbig, who put up like 6 sacks as a backup. He played like 47% of those snaps or something like that and had a bunch of sacks. And then obviously, of all the teams that I've looked at so far, they have some of the best interior pass rushers with Keanu Benton and Larry Ogunjobi. Now, their run defense is not that great because of that, but those two players are very good at pass rush. The Steelers already had 47 sacks last year. I think they could be even better this year in terms of pressure and sacks.
Yeah, absolutely. In my notes here, you can see I wrote down pass rush and then crossed it out and just went with front seven as a whole. And yeah, TJ Watt, absolutely phenomenal. Potentially the best defensive player that we've seen ever. I'd hesitate to maybe say that, but he's definitely one of the best right now. And I think he absolutely should have won Defensive Player of the Year last year. League best 19 sacks. He played every game, I believe. Um, yeah, played all 17 games after coming back from a really rough injury plagued season the year before. And yeah, all the people you mentioned I have here, plus the addition of Patrick Queen. I'm a really big fan of that signing. Um, I don't see a situation that this front seven can't handle, honestly. They've just got so much talent and so much power, um, led by, like we said, TJ Watt.
Yeah, I will actually add on to what you said there. Obviously, the signing of Patrick Queen, they paid so much money for that man. But I think that it's a wise move by them, obviously. It's worth noting that now Cole Holcomb, who was a starter alongside their current starter, Elandon Roberts, is now a backup on that team, and he was already a solid starter at linebacker. So now their linebacking core is probably second to only a couple of teams, maybe Chicago Baltimore, maybe Seattle, in terms of linebacking. I think that those are, some really strong linebackers there. And then obviously they drafted Peyton Wilson in the third round, 98th overall, who I think can and will eventually be a starter. So I agree with the front seven sentiment there.
Yeah, absolutely. On the flip side, moving away from the defense, I have their biggest weakness as being their pass game. I find their pass game offensive. I do not like any part of it. I don't like the quarterbacks. I think there are too many question marks there. I'm just they the two quarterbacks that they signed are the most sacked quarterbacks, number one and two, over the last two seasons. I know we talked about that last week, with Geno Smith being number three, but that's not a good sign. And you can say some of that's on the offensive line. That might be true, but the best quarterbacks are going to get out of that situation. They're going to throw the ball faster, etc. I don't like the receivers beyond Pickens. I There's just nobody really that I'm like, oh yeah, that's a good receiver. They're okay. They're all right. It feels to me like they have a lot of number three and number four receivers lined up behind George Pickens, and I'm just not very impressed with that either. Fortunately for them, I think they've made some improvements to the offensive line that has been really bad the last couple seasons. And that should definitely help Arthur Smith, who, as we know, loves to run. And I was impressed by Najee Harris and Jalen Warren. I think the second half, second three quarters, or the last three quarters of last season as well. I think they really put something together. They had a good system going. So I think there is hope for the offense, but not as far as the passing game goes. What do you think about that?
I I can see where you're going with it, right? I think George Pickens is far beyond their best receiver. But I don't know. I was a fan of the Van Jefferson signing from Los Angeles. He is a good receiver. Maybe not a great receiver, but a good one. They drafted Roman Wilson out of Michigan, who I think Roman Wilson is very similar to JJ McCarthy in kind of how I explain him. I think that they both came out of a system that didn't really accentuate their best parts. I think Roman Wilson can and will be a very, very good receiver in the NFL, but he was in a run first, short pass game type of offense, similar to JJ McCarthy. I think JJ McCarthy can be a very good, deep passer and all of that, but we just didn't see that in Michigan's offense, is kind of what I'm trying to say. I think Roman Wilson's a great round out to that offensive trio, and I think that that's why we didn't see Pittsburgh make a move for a receiver, because I definitely think that if they were genuinely like gung ho on getting a receiver, they would have. Maybe not Brandon Ayuk, but I think they definitely would have gotten a receiver. Calvin Ridley was on the market. Tyler Boyd was on the market. Like they could have and should have gotten a receiver, and they didn't. I think that that was because they feel perfectly comfortable with their receiving core, especially considering Arthur Smith being that offensive coordinator. They're not going to be passing as much as they were last year. And so I don't think that they find they have to rely on some guy who can get 190 targets in a season.
Right. And yeah, Roman Wilson might be a good receiver, but you said that he wasn't in a good system because it was a run first team, and yet he's on an offense run by Arthur Smith. I'm not convinced the receivers are going to be anything impressive. I will say Van Jefferson is a pretty good receiver. I do like him. I think he belongs in kind of a number three spot though. I don't know that he's necessarily a number two receiver. I mean, we saw what happened in LA when Puka Nakua got added. I mean, he just jumped right over Van Jefferson, and obviously, Nakua is a very, very special receiver. Very athletic player, very talented, but he still immediately jumped over him. So I'm just not sure that we're going to see anything super impressive from anybody not named George Pickens.
Yeah, I get where you're coming from. I don't know if I would list it as my biggest weakness, but I definitely agree. It is a weakness of their team.
All right, so what did you put down as their biggest weakness?
So I actually put down their offensive line. I think that they made some good improvements to the line that in time will make this offensive line a lot better. But like you said already, Russell Wilson and or Justin Fields are going to be under center. You need a pretty good line for those guys to perform at a level that you want them to perform at. I think that last year, obviously, rookie Troy Fautanu was my favorite offensive lineman in this draft by far. I mean, was just so good, and more on him later. Sneak peek. But anyway, he's very raw right now, lacks some finesse as a player. So I think he's going to need time to develop into a full-fledged tackle. He is likely projecting to left tackle right now, which could be a little bit tough for whoever is under center for the Pittsburgh Steelers on their blind side. Isaac Seumalo obviously was signed away from the 2022 Super Bowl Eagles, right? Uh, since then, he has not played even close to the level that he did in 2022. And I don't think he will ever reach those heights again. He's not a bad guard, but he's not some elite player. Obviously, on the other side, at right tackle, 2023 first rounder Broderick Jones. He was good, not great, but that's to be expected of a rookie first rounder. I think he will show very great strides in his sophomore year. But again, there's some weaknesses there. He is young. Right guard, James Daniels. I think he was always overpaid when he signed away from Chicago. Uh, I don't think that he was ever the player that his contract says he is. He is a good guard, but not a great guard. And I think that he definitely showed a lot of weakness in 2023, especially as a pass blocker. Finally, we have Zach Frazier, who is a rookie second rounder this year. I think that he could possibly be the best inside offensive lineman this year, best inside offensive line rookie this year. He's a start ready center, and they're hard to come by in the draft. But by and large, I don't think that this offensive line is going to be as cohesive as I made it sound, just because it's a lot of new parts. It's a lot of parts that are good, not great. So I think that for this to be the worst part of their team, in my opinion, it's not the worst thing in the world, but it is definitely a weakness for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I can agree. I do like the improvements they've made. I think they've started to make some moves that are going to benefit them in the future. I do agree. It's hard to tell if those will work immediately or if it's going to take some time. It's always difficult to tell with offensive lines, and I do tend to lean towards it's going to take some time for cohesion to appear. So yeah, I think that's a really good pick. All right, that brings us up to X Factor. I ended up going with a super young player, rookie last year, Joey Porter Jr., cornerback. Um, I think overall he had a solid rookie season. Definitely made mistakes, it's to be expected from a rookie. And on the stat sheet, not the flashiest, but I think he really did pass the eye test. If you look, he's really got all the fundamentals. He only came away with one pick, but he's just a very disciplined player for the most part, and he's really got all of the athleticism and the physical talent to be able to be a really, really solid corner moving forward.
I agree 100%. He is not my X factor, but he definitely I think was one of my final picks before I chose mine. Um, it's worth noting, yeah, sure, he only came away with one pick, but he was only targeted 63 times, which as a number one corner who's pretty much meg on their number one receiver, whoever they're playing against, that 63 times means he's putting up some pretty good coverage. In addition, out of those 63 targets, he only allowed 30 completions. That's 47.6%. That's really, really good. An average around the league for cornerback completion rate is like 57 to like 67, something around that range, 50 to 60. Under 50% is an elite number for any cornerback. So in my opinion, sure, one pick, but I don't like frankly, I don't care all that much because, we saw Trevon Diggs a couple of years back have what was it, 12 interceptions or something wild, and he allowed 72% completions or something like that. So interceptions aren't everything, and I completely agree. Joey Porter will make or break the secondary this year. I actually said quarterback, not Russell Wilson, not Justin Fields. I said quarterback. This is because I mean, obviously, I think everybody is expecting Russell Wilson to be the starter in Week 1, signing a veteran minimum deal from after being in Denver for the last 2 years. But I think just based off of what we saw from him the last couple of years, we've seen some age, we've seen some inconsistency. I think that there's a sizable chance that he won't be starting by the end of the season, and there are a couple scenarios in which that happens. I think if Wilson struggles, but Pittsburgh is still in playoff contention, I think there's a chance they pull the plug and give Fields a try because they're still in playoff contention, but Wilson's not doing great. I think that if they are not in playoff contention and Wilson's doing fine or struggling, I think there's a chance that they put in Fields because it's the whole, hey, Russ is on a 1 year deal, Fields is on a 1 year deal. Why don't we go ahead and try to figure out like what our future is going to be, right? And if we're already not in playoff contention, we might as well try both guys. Either way, I think that whoever is under center could sway the Steelers' season for better or worse. So I think that that is a true X factor.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Like I said before, there's just so many question marks about who's going to start, what kind of players we're going to see. We've obviously seen really, really great things from Russell Wilson, not just in the past with the Seahawks, but he even had really great games and plays with the Broncos. He, people like to make fun of him and Broncos country, let's ride, but he really did have some solid moments, some solid games. And the same can be said for Justin Fields. Overall, not the best performance. You can blame some of that on the Bears, you can blame some of that on him, but he also had some really amazing moments and some really amazing games. And so it kind of depends on which versions we get, how they fit into the offense, and whether or not their passing game can kind of form around them instead of forcing them into a system they don't work well in. But yeah, I totally agree. I think that's a really good make or break point for this season.
I agree. I think Arthur Smith is going to put together an offense that fits them both pretty well in terms of their skill sets. I think running the ball first, prioritizing that's going to help both of them in terms of just how they play football. But yeah, I agree. It's just sometimes you get a different type of Russell Wilson or a different type of Justin Fields, and it's going to be really interesting to see whether they can put together a consistent 17 games or not.
Moving on to the notable rookie, I have a feeling I know who yours is, and I think it's the same one I picked. Is it Troy Fatanu?
For me, I have to talk about him. Troy Fautanu was one of my favorite players in the draft this year. He was definitely my favorite offensive lineman. Um, he reminded me of Tevin Jenkins when he came out of the draft in, I think it was 2021. Just in terms of his physicality, he finishes his plays pretty much on top of the defender as much as he possibly can. He is violent, he is angry, he's a brawler, and he is so strong. Um, Similar to Tevin Jenkins, he gets some drawbacks because he's got short arms, or maybe his finesse isn't great yet, so he might struggle at tackle. But here's the deal: Troy Fautanu is a very smart player. He showed a lot of development in his time at Washington. I think that he is going to continue to develop in the NFL. And he played in a pass first, finesse forward offense with Washington. I don't think that he's going to have much of an issue to continue to develop in that, especially in a run first offense with Pittsburgh. He's going to have time to develop, he's going to have time to learn. And I think he is way more talented than people give him credit for, and he will flourish at tackle for the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. This is another one of those picks that I had correct in my mock draft. Part of why I picked him for the notable rookie. But yeah, I also think there's a lot of opportunity for day one impact. He's going to be able to come in, get snaps right off the bat, and prove himself as a solid tackle. I think the opportunity to guard for Russell Wilson would be amazing. I think a lot of offensive linemen have kind of, especially the young ones who grew up watching Russell Wilson with the Seahawks. I think that's got to be a dream come true. And just to be able to come in and make an impact right off the bat in a position that has to be able to lead the team. The offensive line has to be the core. They've got to lead this offense. And I think that's just a really great opportunity for him to make that impact. Yeah, so that brings us again to the last point here, the notable games, biggest games. Once again, we've kind of got a pattern of divisional games being super important. I picked weeks 11 through 14. At Ravens, at Browns, at Bengals, then they host the Browns. That's just so difficult. 4 divisional games in a row, 2 away, 2 at home, with the Browns almost back to back, sandwiching the Bengals. That might be one of the toughest stretches that I've seen so far in this listing.
No, I agree completely. We've talked about how important um, the late season is going to be for all of, I mean, pretty much every team in the NFL, but specifically all of these AFC North teams being so physical, so just brutal games against each other. These late games, we've seen it happen year after year after year. These late divisional games decide, frankly, who wins the division a lot of years. And so those 4 in a row is going to hurt a lot for whichever teams come out on bottom.
All right. That wraps that up and brings us to the last team on the docket for tonight, which is the Cincinnati Bengals. As their biggest strength, I've listed their pass catcher.
Yeah, I actually for me I said the passing game. So pretty much in line with what you said. With Joe Burrow healthy, frankly, any set of receivers looked a lot more formidable, right? It just happens that he obviously also has Jamar Chase and T. Higgins starting on his team, which is that's just going to elevate him even more, right? I think the loss of Tyler Boyd is going to hurt, but I think it is lessened a great amount by the addition of Alabama's Jermaine Burton, who they took in the third round, 80th overall. I think another bold claim, everybody. I think he has the potential to be a better receiver over his career than Tyler Boyd was. I'm a big fan of Jermaine Burton. We'll get into later why I think he went in the third round. But I think that he is a very good addition to this pass catching core. And then additionally, Mike Gesicki, they signed from the New England Patriots this past offseason, is a clear upgrade over blocking specialist Drew Sample, who is still on the roster. But Gesicki definitely fits that vertical pass first offense that Cincinnati is prioritizing running under Zach Taylor. So I think that he is also going to really kind of help complement this group of pass catchers and their passing game in general.
Yeah, that's fair. I did. Yeah, I mean, we pretty much agree here that the passing game's going to be strong. I think Gesicki has declined over the last couple of years. I think he used to be a lot more solid. His last year in Miami and then his time in New England was a little bit less impressive than previously. If anybody can bring the best back out of him, it's going to be Joe Burrow. But it's possible that he still continues on a slight downward trend statistically. So it's definitely somebody to keep an eye on.
Mike Gesicki is not the player that he was, when he was 24, 25 in Miami. He's definitely not that player anymore. It's worth noting New England was a garbage fire last year, to put it the simplest way possible. So that definitely impacted his performance. But additionally, I think Gesicki doesn't have to be as good as he was 3, 4, 5 years ago because he's got, like we talked about, Jamar Chase, and he's got T. Higgins, and he's got Jermaine Burton. And so, with those weapons around him and Joe Burrow throwing to him, I think he'll be fine.
All right, what do you have as the greatest weakness for the Bengals?
Kind of the opposite of the passing game here. I talked about the run game as their biggest weakness. Joe Mixon was clearly showing some age near the end of his time in Cincinnati. As we've talked about, running backs have a really short shelf life. But I think that even at the end of his time in Cincinnati, he is decidedly a better player than who they now have on the roster, which is Zach Moss and Chase Brown. Chase Brown they drafted a couple of years ago. Zach Moss was a free agent signing from Indianapolis. I think that there's a chance that Moss and Brown can produce equal to and potentially even put up a bit more yards than Joe Mixon. But they are both less dynamic players in general, and I think that that may cause issues for Cincinnati by and large. Obviously, they are a pass first offense, but I still think that it could cause issues in the long run for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I partially agree here. I have running backs slash run defense. I think just running both sides of the ball, not a great place for this team. Uh, if you look at Zach Moss's stats from last year, you'll notice that he has back-to-back games, one of which he runs for 165 yards, and the next week 21. He's just not consistent. The 165 yards was pretty unheard of, not his typical game, but it just kind of shows like he's not the most consistent rusher. And the same can be said for Chase Brown. He had some up and down games. Overall, I just don't know that they're going to be able to fully replace what Joe Mixon had done for that team, even despite the decline that we did see in Joe Mixon's game. Additionally, the Bengals' run defense last year was ranked 25th out of 32. Not really great, and I didn't see a whole lot of moves to fix that. Obviously, they've got like Trey Hendrickson, he's an awesome player, not as great against the run, and I would have just liked to have seen a little bit more to try to fix that lacking run defense.
I agree. That actually kind of brings me to my X factor that I listed, which is the run defense. Um, I think that I agree completely. They were not very great against the run. Their defense in general kind of struggled in a couple of places. They let DJ Reader sign away with the Lions. Right, they signed Houston Texan Sheldon Rankins to take his place. I agree. Trey Hendrickson and Sam Hubbard are good, but they're better against the pass. I think that picking Chris Jenkins is kind of the X factor in within that X factor, if that makes sense. They took him in the second round, 49th overall, out of Michigan. I think he's a great interior defensive lineman, and I think that there is a solid chance that as a NFL player he could perform better than DJ Reader did over the last year or two. But I think that the defensive line, especially their run game, may be the deciding factor in a lot of games that the Bengals play in the next couple of years. And so we could see that being their X factor this year.
Yeah, absolutely. I went a little bit more simplistic. Joe Burrow, highest paid quarterback in the NFL. Obviously, he's had phenomenal seasons when he stayed healthy. Unfortunately, last year he had another injury that ended his season, and I talked about this last week with Matthew Stafford, with Joe Burrow talking about the football mortality, and that's really got to make us question kind of where Burrow's headspace is as he goes into the season. Is he going to be fully focused, or is he starting to think like about getting out? He's again the highest paid quarterback in the NFL, tied with Trevor Lawrence on a per year basis. And when you've got that money, you've made it. Is he going to really go all in? Is he going to focus more on protecting himself and less on how to make the team the best it can be? I think his mentality and him staying healthy are going to really really affect how this team performs moving forward this season.
Yeah, I agree. And obviously last year Burrow had a choice in like whether he played or didn't play, like coming out of training camp with that ankle injury and things like that. But there's always an organizational pressure on these players to say like, "Hey, you can move even if it hurts. Go out and play football for us. We're paying you X amount of money to do so." And so like it's worth wondering kind of obviously we'll never know what happened inside that building that year, but it's always worth wondering what was the back and forth there, what was the balance between Burrow saying, "Hey, this really hurts. I shouldn't play on it," and the Cincinnati organization trying to pressure that and push that. And so I definitely agree he could be in a mindset of like, okay, I played through an injury and then I had a season-ending injury that was non-contact, by the way, and completely unpredictable. And it's worth saying like, look, is he gonna be focused fully on, hey, let's get back to the Super Bowl again? Because he might be a little worried about his health and his future.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree completely. That does actually kind of lead into who I picked for the notable rookie, Amarius Mims, offensive lineman. Obviously, Joe Burrow needs protection. He's taken 148 sacks in his 4 years, only 52 games because of his two season ending injuries. That is 37 sacks a season or 2.8 sacks per game. Those are not good numbers. And with those two season ending injuries, he's really got to be protected well. They haven't seemed to have prioritized the offensive line a whole lot. So I'm happy to see that they're finally making some moves and hopefully developing younger players. I know Jonah Williams is a pretty solid option for them. Hopefully he continues to improve. But I think Amarius Mims is just another guy who's going to be able to come in, protect Burrow, and give him a shot at staying healthy this season.
Yeah, I agree. I almost put Amarius Mims. He was my second notable rookie. I'm a big fan of Amarius Mims. I think he's a little bit of a raw offensive lineman, but I think Cincinnati has done very well in the past developing offensive linemen. So I think that Mims will show up and he will become a very solid player for Cincinnati and obviously helping Joe Burrow, stay alive like he likes to do. My notable rookie, I already mentioned him once, and I specifically didn't go into detail just because I knew I would get to him. That is Alabama wide receiver Jermaine Burton. He was taken number 80 overall in the third round. Uh, this receiver class, we all know, was a really, really deep one. Obviously, there were some really strong receivers up top. And so I think to an extent, there were some diamonds in the rough later in the draft. Two right off the top of my head, two of my favorite receivers in this draft, frankly, outside of like the first round, were Jermaine Burton and Malachi Corley. We'll probably talk about Corley later. But I think he was very overlooked in this draft class, and I think Cincinnati came away with a really good one. He has incredible deep route running, great catch radius, 50-50 ball awareness. You would see so many times last year he'd be downfield and Jalen Milrow would just be like, well, Burton's down there, somewhere. I don't know. And Burton would come up with the ball. He would every time. I think that because of that, he could definitely be a day one contributor for the Bengals. Some drawbacks to Jermaine Burton. I think he definitely needs to work on his route running, specifically at short and intermediate levels. But if he continues to work at that and really focus, during OTAs, training camp, I think that he could be a really consistent contributor for Cincinnati and frankly replace that Tyler Boyd gap that is left in that offense and be that number three and eventually number two if we see T. Higgins leave in free agency or even Jamar Chase, God forbid.
Finally, that brings us to the biggest games for the Cincinnati Bengals. What do you have listed for their biggest games?
So one of my first notes I made on their schedule is it's worth noting, obviously, how the NFL builds schedules is some of those games are entirely based off of what position you were ranked in your division, and then you play the same ranked teams in other divisions. So Cincinnati was a 9-8 team, and they were competing for the playoffs to their final gasp. And they were missing Joe Burrow. They had injury problems, and they still placed fourth place. What that means is I think Cincinnati, as I already said, is a much better team now than they were last year, and they were fourth place, meaning they're playing the likes of New England, Washington, Carolina, Tennessee. And we can probably go back and forth on kind of the level of these different teams, but the fact is they were fourth place for a reason. And I think that Cincinnati has an upper hand against at least three of those four teams, leading to a potentially easier route to the playoffs than their AFC North rivals. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely in their favor that they were ranked lower. They were seated lower last season. I did take note of them being able to play the Patriots and the Commanders. I think those are going to be pretty easy games. The really interesting thing to me was the fact that those two games are in their first three. I looked back over the last 4 years during Burrow's career, and they tend to start pretty slow in the first three games of the season. In those 4 years, through the first three games of each season, they are 4-7-1. Um, Not great, under .500. And their first three games this season are the Patriots, Chiefs, and Commanders. If they can pull away with 2 wins, they'll already be better off than I believe any of those 4 seasons with Burrow in the first three games. So I think the key for them is going to be opening the season a little bit stronger than normal, and then they can just continue to do what they do and improve throughout the season.
I agree completely. And like you said, being that some of those early games are those fourth place teams that we know are not that great, and will not be, cream of the crop this year, I think that there's a real chance that they can do that. Side note, they also play Kansas City in week 2, like you said, so there's always that. All right, everybody. We are, as always, so happy to have you guys here watching the Seagull Football Network. Um, always, keep tuning in, watching us, leave a comment, share it with somebody you know. We love talking about football. We hope you love listening to us talk about football. And if you have a friend, a relative, a loved one who would enjoy it just as much as we do or you do, definitely share it. Keep an eye on our X account. Hopefully, we'll be making some posts on there as we get closer to the season. And definitely, leave your thoughts. Like I said, all right, we will be back next week with the NFC North. Super excited to kind of talk about those teams. As you all know, I'm a Bears fan, so that's going to be a whole thing. But anyway, we hope you guys have a great rest of your week, and we will see you later.